Good afternoon. We'll get this right in a moment. This is a bang-up crowd. Thank you for braving the heat. Hopefully it will not rain today on your way home this day. We're glad to have you here. We know the setup's a little tricky. The stage is a little closer than we expected, so we know the sight lines for the images over here are not great from over there. After the program, we'll continue to loop those. Okay, so you have a chance to look those through. There's probably about 100. Many of them are drawn from the scrapbooks I mentioned that you can browse through on the table back there after the program with the refreshments and all the other things that are there. Again, my name is Eric Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of the Rockbridge Historical Society. This is our first time in my time here having a program at Perry McClure High School, and we're glad to be here. We've clearly got some good fans here. I have a request for a hand show of members of the class of '69. All right, they're coming up. They're coming up. And many classes, many generations here. That is a big part of what we want to do in our community programs. We want to draw on the wisdom, the resources, the energy of people all around Rockbridge County with lots of different interests. And so we put together a program today that tries to draw on different perspectives. We're going to have a scientist, a meteorologist start us off. We've got a journalist, archivist, a musician, historians. These are the different ways we can approach history and find rich threads through those different perspectives. I do want to say that what we think of as the real anchor of this program is going to come in the second half. And we've got a few more mics and some cameras than we're used to. Part of that is we're looking to record not so much what's happening in the opening presentations. We hope those have value. We know they have value. But what we really want to take away are the things that you can bring to the table. In order to do that, we're going to try to have people come up to this microphone where our videographer can get a good bead on that. We understand that the way the seats are set up, that may not work so well, but maybe we'll try people coming down first if you can, and then we'll move those around as best you can. So we ask your patience on that and look forward to it. First, thanks to Buena Vista City Public Schools, Principal Melissa Cobb, Superintendent Keeler. There have been a lot of moving pieces here, and we appreciate their doing that. We also appreciate their helping us work in their schools. We've got a new school unit program based on Hurricane Camille that can target 4th graders, 7th graders with science, history, photography, creative writing, art, just the kinds of things I'm saying. So the partnerships between what we do as a lifelong learning organization and also connected with our area schools, not just K-12, but the 3, 4 universities and colleges in the area is very central to our mission. The other thanks I need to give are to the board members and volunteers of the Rockbridge Historical Society. Our president, Mary Harvey Halseth, has been shuffling around everywhere. Raise your hand, Mary. Thank you. Please stand up if you are a present or past board member or volunteer for RHS. That's not a request, that's a command. Okay. So I'm seeing about 20 there, audience of maybe 250, so that means about 230 of you should come see those people afterwards and join us in that. We depend on that. Okay, we are a community enterprise. You never know how your interests and your resources may help us and help your neighbors. Lastly, thanks to our members, our donors, our community partners, your financial support, your time, your interests, your questions are crucial. Many of you will have just received our fundraising mailing. I could even pull one out over there. And we have some big plans. We have some big plans to renovate our museum, to match the kinds of variety we do in our public programs and education with the resources we have there for a true community museum. We hope everyone will stay tuned to that and want to join in part. So, to the program itself, we're We're going to start in just a second with Brent Watts. He will be known to many of you as the Chief Meteorologist at WDBJ7. They have been doing wonderful Camille programming all week, both here and Nelson County, who is also having their commemorative program right now for the very same reasons that we are. Matt Paxton Jr. Will then take the mic, speak about his experiences reporting in the field in the days of August 1969. Tom Camden on the far end of the stage, who is Washington Lee's chief archivist, the head of special collections, also an RHS board member, will talk about his experiences as a teenager and why the records of local history, whether they be images, documents, oral histories, are so important. So I thank each of you for buying into this. I'm excited to hear what you have to say. Before passing that off, just wanted to share a few things that I have learned this week, stories. I was born 1 year after Camille, so it was not part of my known experience. But among the more vivid images and accounts that have been shared in person, people who have contacted us or written in, here are some of the following. We've all seen lots of pictures, and you'll see them again. A lot of you have these personal memories, I suspect. I know some of the people who shared some of these are in the audience. Here are a few. A woman listening to the rains that built up that Tuesday night, 2 days out from a pregnancy due date, and hearing then that the roadbed had washed away. A first responder leaving his own pregnant wife and child behind to save the life of another child. Only the top of the old sign at Kenny's clearing the water, with 29 feet and 3 inches of water at Caches, Texaco, with watermarks still to prove. A world-famous painter scrambling to move his paintings and sculptures upstairs in Rockbridge baths, and a post-storm run on flowers at Shaner's greenhouse. Funerals for the 23 who died in Rockbridge County, including all 8 members of a single family. Helicopter rescues off the factory roofs. Mark will sing a song that speaks to that. What Barry Staten spoke of as the strange slicks of true ice cream floats as the ice cream flowed into the water, the smell of spoiled beer, and the cases of free beer that were given away by various stores. Watching a shrill, caterwauling cat, one reader wrote, float by on a barrel and snatching a 7-year-old girl off a hay bale, the only member of her family to survive and to tell the tale. Lastly, a man whose uncanny ability to distinguish between the wrenching smell of dead animals and human corpses saved both time and lives in the rescue and recovery efforts. These are all community stories, some already on record, many newly captured. Today is another hallmark moment in that process of preserving history and passing it on. We hope that your stories will join this archive. And again, if you don't feel moved to share at the mic today, please sign up on, give us your email, a phone number, so that Tom Camden and his staff or we at RHS can find ways to bring this into generational memory. Thank you again for coming out. I'm going to cue up Mr. Watts' slideshow and thank him for making it up 81 through another I-81 accident. Yes, that's right.
How is everyone today? Great. Great. Thank you so much. So I was worried on the way down that I was going to be late because, of course, as Eric mentioned, there was an accident, or maybe 15, on Interstate 81. And so it is, I know, I don't know what it is. But so what I did is I turned on, I've got the satellite radio, it basically turned on the 1960s. I'm like, I actually did this before the accident, before their accidents were even on the interstate. I'm like, I need to get in the mood, feel it. And I don't think I would have made it down here without being without listening to the 60s music, because it was amazing. So props to everybody from the 60s to making some great music, seriously. It put me in a great mood. I'm going to pull up my slideshow here just on this so that I can see it too, so I don't have to keep looking back and forth. And because I am, I'm 42 now, and your vision is not what it used to be. All right. So what I thought we'd start out doing is I'll give you a little background on me. Basically, I'm a chief meteorologist at WDBJ7 in Roanoke. We cover this entire area. Back during the day, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, we had a news department at that time, but as you remember, back in the 60s, the television pretty much shut off in the evening, and at night, it was, you went to bed. That was it. And by the next morning, you woke up, you flipped on the TV, and hopefully, nothing terrible happened overnight. And so, obviously this was one of those things that we covered after the fact, but back in the day, meteorology was just not what it is today. So I thought we'd start out, we'll flip through, Eric will get a couple of these pictures, and this is, I'll start out with the first one here, and you can see, we'll go ahead and flip that one. And this, very familiar, you'll see a lot of pictures in the books. Of course, this is Sycamore Avenue, the day after the flood, cars piled up on each other. And then Eric, flip to the next one and you'll see that today, very much resilient. Everything's built back. What's fascinating to see some of the same buildings that were still there. But of course, everybody's adapted to flooding after Camille. So the next slide is going to show you guys the track of this, and I'll describe it because it's tough for you to see. So Camille started out off the African coast, as storms do this time of year a lot of times, and it wasn't a storm really until it got to Cuba, or almost Cuba. It became a Category 2 hurricane, made landfall in Cuba, went out in the Gulf of Mexico, re-strengthened almost immediately to Category 5 status. And at that time, there were no hurricane categories. That was actually prompted by Camille. So then it was just a strong storm that forecasters had tried to predict what was going to happen, where it was going to hit. They predicted it 3 different times to go into Florida. And by 15 hours before it got ready to hit the United States, is one of the strongest hurricanes ever at that time. They gave them 15 hours notice. Can you imagine 15 hours notice to pack up everything and run as far inland as you can get? But that is what happened. From there, what we know as Camille fell apart and became a low pressure system. It eventually moved up into the Ohio Valley and then moved along a front. And a front basically just caused it to go in one line straight across from Ohio all the way out to the ocean. Now, what you may not realize is that Camille never stalled. The remnants never stalled at all. What happened was, it was a process called back building. And basically what happened is the storm was building on itself. And we'll get into that in a second. But there was basically the rain moved all across from the 19th to the 20th, and then emerged over the ocean and re-strengthened back into a tropical storm. So there was a transformation that was ongoing as it was moving over top of our area. All right, Eric, this will be a close-up view of that. And the actual center of Camille moved just south of Rockbridge in Amherst County. So that plays a little bit of part in what happened. Now, we'll zip through a couple slides here, Eric. These are basically, there should be a play button at the bottom or there. If not, it's not that big of a deal. But what I was going to show you is the difference. Yeah, this is before, and then this is after when it comes to satellite prediction. Back in the day, there were satellites in space, but the satellite was not very good. The images came in maybe a couple times a day. They were able to up those. Now we get satellite images every minute, and the satellite basically can zoom all the way down into the eye of a hurricane. So what you can zoom, one more slide, and you'll be able to see that the hurricane itself, that's the inside of a hurricane. So that's the eye. We can get so detailed nowadays. So let's go on and talk a couple things about how this all came about. So back in the day, weather forecasting, there was a whole lot different than what we are today. So there was a U.S. Weather Bureau. The National Weather Service didn't even exist. It was not going to be developed until the year after Camille. So there was a U.S. Weather Bureau. There was an office that was in Lynchburg, which was responsible for this area. What was interesting about it is that it closed at 7 p.m. So it was only open from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. The meteorologists went home. Meteorologists at the time were a commodity. I mean, you just could not find a meteorologist around, so they basically worked during the day, then they went home, and then they came back the next day. They were the main forecasters. There were technicians that were in the office that were there kind of keeping track. after hours. There was also an office in Richmond, and then the main office in Washington, D.C., which is where the closest radar was. So very little radar at the time. There was an old radar, a World War II bombing radar that was in Richmond, but it didn't really detect rain very well, so it was nearly impossible. And of course, back then, river observations were essentially, I go out, check a gauge, I either call you or teletype or whatever into the Weather Service office. And that was done just as often as you could, usually at 7 in the morning, 7 in the evening. Those seem to be the times when those took place. All right, so what I want to show you, we'll kind of go through the timeline. So the rain, and some of you probably have a better recollection, obviously, than some of the official records, but rain started around the late afternoon, early evening. There were some plans people had that got canceled because of the rain had started. It was a very wet summer. The ground was wet. Runoff occurred almost immediately as soon as that rain started. So Eric, in the next slide, what you're going to see is you're going to see that storm as it began to move near us. It interacted with the mountains, which of course, as we know, we kind of explained to you all that the mountains can squeeze out rain. So when the winds hit up against the mountains and the clouds, it literally acts like a sponge and it just squeezes it out. So anytime you get a storm like this that's impacted by the mountains or goes over the mountains, there's going to be a higher level. Well, at that time, there had not been that much rain that had fallen in Ohio and even in West Virginia, so there was the forecast called for showers, maybe heavy rain at times, ending by the morning. Well, the ending by the morning was about the only thing that they got right in the forecast at that time. So what happened was, it never stalled, but it was called back building. So the storms typically can send out cool air out ahead of the storm, and that cools everything down and hopefully causes the storm to fall apart. Well, it can also sometimes help to form a new storm. And what happened was, instead of it sending out ahead of the storm, that cool air was sent back behind the storm, which created a continuous loop of storms for more than 5 to almost 8 hours, just depending on where you were. So think of the heaviest rain you have ever experienced. Now experience that for about 8 hours, and that's what it was. And this was ongoing all throughout the night with the flooding was beginning. So around 11:45, thank goodness, there was all the accounts that were written from the Weather Bureau is that somebody from Buena Vista, from the police department in Buena Vista, called the Richmond Bureau, the Weather Bureau, and they said, hey, the Maury River is rising fast. Just want to let you know, heads up, that there's probably going to be some flooding here. Well, guess what? There was no meteorologist in the Richmond Bureau, because of course they were ending their day. It was a high commodity out of a meteorologist overnight. So, and they weren't expecting any rain of that much. So it was closed. So the message was carried on and written down by the technician that was there, and they said they would pass it along when the meteorologist got in the next day. So thank you very much. I know, I was like, goodness gracious. So in the middle of the night, the heaviest rain was falling between, say, 10 p.m. and about 6 and 7 in the morning. That's when most of it fell. It kind of wrapped up. So around 3 in the morning, after enough weather observers called in to the Richmond office, they issued a weather statement. And by then, nowadays we think of a severe weather statement, a flood alert. It goes to your phones, your TVs, your radio, everything. Back then, there was no such thing as that. So it basically meant, okay, they wrote it down, and it may have gone in, they sent to the newspapers, may have been sent to the radio stations, but most of them also ended at night. So most of the radio stations would have just gotten that the next morning when they came in. So what's fascinating about all this is this whole time, of course, as we know, flooding in Buena Vista, flooding in Glasgow, the terror that took place in Nelson County, the landslides, all of that took place in the middle of the night. Well, thankfully, the next morning, the Lynchburg office, the meteorologist came in at 6 o'clock to open the office for the day. There was a weather observer that it is recorded in a national government document and research that was done after the fact. His name is Kenneth Chittum. Does anybody know a Kenneth Chittum or have family members that Kenneth Chittum? It is documented that do you know the relationship with Kenneth Chittum? A nephew. Okay. So there is a Kenneth Chittum. This may have been a Kenneth Chittum even beyond that, because he was 81 years old. So this might have been somebody even the past of past. So it's written that Kenneth Chittum, who was the Carrs Creek observer, called the Weather Service office in Lynchburg all frantic. And he called him at 6 a.m. He wasn't supposed to call for another hour. And he says, I've got to call and tell you that we've got terrible flooding in Carrs Creek. All of, Buena Vista's flooded, Glasgow's flooded. We got reports from all around. And what's fascinating is, of course, he wasn't supposed to call for another hour, and he's apologizing to the meteorologist there. I'm sorry, I would have called earlier, but my wife wouldn't let me go out in the heavy rain and take a measurement. That's a great idea. Aren't you glad he didn't? But it was fascinating to see that he's 81 years old and was taking measurements, and that measurement proved to be critical because as soon as that happened, flood forecasting was sent to Richmond to let them know that there was a heck of a flood that was on the way, of course, because our water goes downstream into Richmond. So they let them know that there was flooding that was on the way and coming downstream. There was nothing that we could do now. The damage had already been done when it came to the rainfall here, but they were able to give people a heads up downstream that flood water was coming. So as we all know, what happened beyond that when you wake up in the morning is that Rockbridge was flooded, Nelson County had the loss of life as well. And to be quite honest with you, looking and researching this, it's overwhelming and very emotional because in my lifetime, I will probably, and hope to God, never experience the loss of life that was felt during that one weather event. And we will probably never experience that again. Hopefully never, even with the worst weather disaster that we have, just because of the heads up with weather technology and the heads up with people building it. There was so much that went on beyond Hurricane Camille. And we'll get to that in a second, but I did want to show you some of the record levels in the Maury River that happened on this next slide. One more, Eric. And so the Maury River, that stands as the top, by far, record level that has ever happened. It got flood stage is 17 feet. It got up to 31.2 feet during Hurricane Camille. But we have had other weather events since then that came close, kind of. So the flood of 85 was 26 feet. And notice in 22 feet back in March of 1963. Does anybody remember that one? So 1963, it was a lot of heavy snow that year, just tons of snow, and that started melting, and then there was a lot of rainstorms. So there was flooding that took place, which took the river up several feet above flood stage. And then the most recent one was 1995. It was in June where it got up to a couple feet above flood stage. That too was a heavy rain event once again. Very similar. It actually caused mudslides in Madison County. So it was a one huge event. Now I want to wrap up because I want to kind of keep us on time. I will tell you that if you have any questions about anything, and I can expand on it, it was very fascinating to research this, but I want to show you what has changed since then. So since then, we now have a National Weather Service office that's open 24 hours a day. Meteorologists are staffed at Weather Service, multiple meteorologists, every single day, every holiday, every night, every single night of the year, there's multiple meteorologists that are in that office. Not to mention, right after this happened, what was called the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale was introduced, the Cat 1, the Category 2, the Category 3. Camille prompted that because of so much damage that had happened. The other thing that we have had happen is that television and also radio are now instant, so we can get messages out to you in an instant, along with cell phones. There are meteorologists now, multiple meteorologists that staff every single television station, and that means overnight as well. And we thankfully have resources. We can pull in even more if we need to. So to have event like this happen again when it comes to the loss of life, God forbid, I hope it never does. I don't think it will. But will we ever have another Camille rainfall? Absolutely. I'm very confident that will happen once again. Will we have mudslides again? Absolutely. It's going to happen again. Where it happens, we don't know. You just don't know until it begins to set up. But from an atmospheric standpoint, what we see is that more and more heavier rainfall events are happening, and we also know that hurricanes can happen and do the exact same thing that they did when Camille moved through in 1969. Weather observing has increased a lot. There's now Doppler radars all over the place. There's also automated rain gauges, so we no longer have to call you up, or you have to call us up and get a rainfall amount. It happens instantly. So as soon as we see that there's so much rain that has fallen, it triggers certain things to happen so that we know instantly and can send out notifications, or the Weather Service can send out alerts. The other thing I'll end with is that we now have a better understanding and a respect for the weather thanks to Camille. And if Camille had never happened, we would have to wait for another flood, the flood of '85, before we really started to see, devastation and disaster and loss of life. But we learned a lot from Camille, and I know everybody did. Meteorologists did. After that, there was a huge spike in the number of people that got into meteorology, got into science, because of the fascination for this. And thank God they did, because I can't imagine how many lives have been saved because people had a fascination and wanted to learn more about Camille. I honestly can't wait for the second part, as Eric mentioned, of this, where I get to hear the stories, because to me, researching this was just fascinating, because I literally went back and I looked through, there's a website that literally shows every single grave site, and people have uploaded photos, family photos, and it was heartbreaking. I mean, literally just heartbreaking to see the stories that came through, and I know that you all may have some of those as well. So I wanted to show you just a meteorological perspective about Camille, how Camille came about. I will definitely be here afterwards. I'm going to stay through the whole thing, and if you have any questions, specific ones, feel free to ask, and I'll do everything that I can to answer those. So I thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing from you all as well about your stories from Camille. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? I'll try to be close to this mic. I'm Matt Paxton. I don't know whether it was too confusing to tell who was speaking when, but I was the editor of the local newspaper, the News Gazette, before my retirement in '94, but that was basically a desk job, and I had to coordinate all the news, photographs, and whatever came in, and get them together for publication in the newspaper. So I didn't get much out very often on these emergencies. But this was something very unusual. We could tell at the time. And after the remnants of Camille came crashing into Rockbridge County, I had to grab a camera and go out in the South River area to see what I could find out there. I don't know what possessed me, but I took our 15-year-old son, Matt, with me, and we started to go through the field along South River toward the Sprunt's substantial old brick house near the mouth of the South River. We were walking through pasture field. This was the morning after the bulk of the storm, and I looked ahead, and here came a group of men. I couldn't tell what they were doing, and I soon saw they were carrying a corpse on a stretcher, and I felt really guilty about taking my son out to that tragic spot. But that was my main. The picture showed up in the paper, and I did what I had to do, but it was no fun. That incident occurred very near to the restored old mill, which was then the home of Mr. and Ms. John Rogers. I don't know how many of you might remember them. At that time, I was unaware of the frightening incident that was happening to them. Their main floor was on 2 levels, and the kitchen was on the lower level. Mr. Rogers, who was not a young man at that time, had gotten a leg stuck in the screen door to the kitchen, and was caught there by the high water until someone could come to the rescue. Mrs. Rogers was an infant, actually, and was unable to help him. The flood crest that Tuesday night was said to be higher than, quote, the memorable flood of 1936. The crest of the Maya River in Buena Vista was reported to be about 30 feet above. We've seen figures around that, but that seems to be about the average. The debris-laden river knocked down 6 steel transmission towers at Glasgow, and so that electrical service was interrupted at 4:15 a.m. Wednesday for about 6,500 customers in the Lexington, Buena Vista, Rockbridge area. Remarkably, service was restored for about 3,000 of these in Lexington and Rockbridge in about 1.5 hours. That was a miracle. And the power at Buena Vista, about 3,000 customers were back in service by 7:30 p.m. that night. That was a remarkable piece of work, and I'm sure involved a whole lot of extra people being brought in here in the emergency. For the next few weeks, much of the space in the News-Gazette was devoted to coverage of the flood's aftermath. Most of the pictures were taken by Jim Dedrick, who lives between Fairfield and South River. Some of you probably know him. His memory of the storm is that, quote, no one had ever seen anything like that before. He remembers that the night of the storm, he had to borrow, the night after the storm, he had to borrow a neighbor's tractor to get home because of remaining high water. The flood left 16 known dead and 7 missing in Rockbridge. Now that was an early figure. The final figure combined those two, and I think so they came up with a total of 23 people. Witnesses saw the Clark family floating down South River in their house. None of them survived. The Red Cross set up a disaster center in the Buena Vista Presbyterian Church Educational Building. When flood victims who had lost everything came in, they gave them a disbursing order for a week's supply of food and to purchase a complete change of clothing. Further help proceeded from there. The Red Cross estimated that at least 300 families would be applying for disaster help. Buena Vista and Glasgow were still without pure drinking water early the next week after the flood. The Buena Vista to Lexington C&O rail line was washed out, and rail service to Lexington permanently ended. The C&O had ended passenger service on that short spur line a few years earlier. We sent a reporter on that final passenger trip. He described it as, quote, uneventful. Rockbridge County farmers lost an estimated $1 million worth of fences and numerous cattle and crops. The weekly Buena Vista News was shut down by the destruction of its equipment in its building on Magnolia Avenue. Following a long tradition in American newspapers, the News-Gazette helped its neighboring newspaper by printing its post-flood issue. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Okay. I usually can speak very loudly. I don't want to blow you out of the gym. It's amazing to see this many people here today. I thought we knew we were going to have a good crowd, but we didn't. I don't think any of us expected this kind of turnout. Closer to the mic, Peter says. Okay. All right. I'm so used to talking loud anyway, but I will try to make sure everybody hears. So I'm Tom Camden. I'm I have a lot of titles, depending on who you talk to. I'm a curator. I'm a special collections director. I'm associate professor at Washington Lee. I'm a number of things. I'm keeper of the university's treasures. Some people say I'm in charge of Alibaba's cave. But today, I'm here because I'm a native son. I grew up here. I'm 1971 graduate of Rockbridge High School, and my whole life has been spent, well, not all my whole life, because I left Rockbridge County for a good long time to pursue a career, but you see what happens. You come back and you never leave again. What do I do? At Washington Lee, I spend a lot of time documenting history. And of course, the history of the region, the history of the South, the history of our school, Washington and Lee University, is important. But I'm also very keen, because I'm a native son, I'm very keen on documenting the history of the community. The university, Washington Lee University, and this community do not exist in vacuums. The school was founded in 1749, and its history is closely intertwined with the history of the community. There is no really separating them. So my role is a dual role. So I spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the history of our community, the entire community, Rockbridge County, is documented. In 2013, I had just left a really good job in Richmond to come back to Washington Lee, to come back to my alma mater. Matt Paxton and I are both graduates of Washington Lee. Matt is class of 1949. I am a class of 1976. I was invited to come back to Washington Lee in 2013. I've been on board maybe 6 months, and I got a call from someone who said, I have been entrusted with a series of photograph albums and scrapbooks that depict the Camille flooding, the Camille tragedy. And I would like to make sure that these pieces, these scrapbooks, are going to be kept in a permanent home. Are you interested? And I said, yes, sir, I am. When can I come see you? This individual who talked to me was Danny Hall. These photograph albums have been put together by a man named Raymond Kirby, who was a Virginia Department of Transportation employee. As you can imagine, the images are much like what we had seen in the press. And I would dare say that many of you have your own photographs, which we hope you'll share with us at some point in the near future. But one of the things that struck me, I went to see Danny Hall. When someone calls me and asks me if I'm interested in acquiring a collection, I usually am there before they can hang up the phone, because you don't get many opportunities. You have to move quickly in this business. So I went to see Danny Hall, and we spent the morning talking about this legacy. He'd been entrusted with these albums by Raymond Kirby, who had passed away. I agreed to take them. Mr. Hall died not long after that. I was not aware that he was terminally ill at the time I was talking to him. The amazing thing about those albums is that they are photographs, many of which we would recognize today. But Mr. Kirby, being a VDOT employee, was keen on documenting the change of the landscape. And I kept going through these albums and thinking, why did Mr. Kirby take so many photographs of piles of brush and, road changes? And of course, in those piles of brush, there were bodies found. So the amazing thing about photograph albums, and I'm going to issue a word of caution here to all of you: go home. If you have not identified your photographs, please do that, because when you're gone, nobody knows what the heck they're looking at. So Mr. Kirby had written captions not under the photographs, which is what archivists would recommend, but on the photographs. And I don't really care because they're wonderful. He wrote the names of the places. He wrote the dates. Many of them are snapshots, but in many cases, that's all we have. So I said 2013, we'll take these, not really thinking about the fact that, 6 years later, we would be marking this anniversary. But those albums have become very important to us. They've been heavily used in the press in the last couple of weeks. Lots of news stories have been done with them. When I was getting ready to talk to reporters from WDBJ and WSLS, I had to do some background work. And as a historian, that's what I do. I mean, you prepare yourself. If you're going to go on camera for a television news spot, you better be ready, because I'm telling you, you'll get bombarded on Facebook and everything else, Snapchat, Twitter. You'll get taken to the woodshed. So I started to do my homework. My wonderful colleagues at the Washington Lee helped me a lot with this. So I started to do my homework. But then I started to remember, because, I was 16 years old when Camille hit. I grew up at Buffalo Forge, out in the south end of the county. I grew up in a house that's at the confluence of the Buffalo and the Maury River. So I remembered it very well. Now, remember now, this is before before the digital age. This is before, instantaneous, viral everything. The imagery that we saw, the press photos that Matt Paxton was taking, that's all we had. We did not have Twitter. We did not have Facebook. I remember vividly, 16 years old, August 20th, the night of August 19th, when that storm hit. I grew up in a house at Buffalo Forge that was built around 1800, and it had a tin roof, big old two-story house. The children's bedrooms were on my siblings, four of us, the bedrooms were on the top floor. Mother's bedroom was on the ground floor. At some point during that night, every one of us, without talking to each other, we made sleepwalking probably, made our way down to my mother's bedroom, where we all made a pallet on the floor and put our pillows in. We woke up the next morning, all of us in the same room, wondering how we all got there. We woke up when one of the neighbors was pounding on the door and saying, "Emma, Emma," my mother was Emma, "Emma, wake up, the world is washing away." Well, as a 16-year-old boy, August 20th, you're a little bit bored with summer. You're ready to go back. You're not quite ready to go back to school, but you're really sort of bored and tired of summer. So for a 16-year-old boy, this was a bit of an adventure, climbing over the ridges with my mother and other neighbors, trying to check on other families downriver who were flooded, who were in their front yards in rowboats. However, it was not very long before that adventure, the reality of that situation, slaps you in the face very quickly. It came to us because, and of course, remember again, this is before cell phones, before communication was basic, and communication had been disrupted because of that flood. So it was a few days later that we learned that my mother's cousin, Silas Clark, and his wife and his children were all washed away. We could not get out to go check on people on South River, but my mother grew up on South River on Irish Creek. My mother was a Clark, and they had been on Irish Creek and South River since 1750s or so. They're still there. They're going to stay there probably forever. So we had I had a personal sort of, suddenly what started as an adventure for a 16-year-old boy at the end of a very hot summer suddenly became very personal. But then, you continue to muck on. You continue to work. You keep going. You keep going. You help your friends as they're trying to salvage their home. And then every now and then, reality still slaps you. I remember the day we were working trying to get furniture and whatever out of my friend's home at the confluence of the Maury and the Buffalo. And there were 4 or 5 of us boys the same age, and we were just working away, and we heard a helicopter. And we were, of course, excited because it was not common for helicopters to land in the pasture next to your house. What we did not know was that they had discovered a body, and we did not know it. We had not gone into the pasture. So the reality of this thing kept coming back to us over and over. One of the things I want us to do after I shut up and you get a chance to talk is I want you to try to tell us a couple of things. First of all, what are 1 or 2 things that you will never forget about this tragedy? And I can tell you the 2 things that come to mind for me immediately, and you're going to understand. The smell. The smell. I will never forget it. I can probably, if I thought about it long enough, I could probably conjure it up now. That kind of earthy smell. The smell of putrefying everything. And then the sound. The sound. Remember I told you that we were in that house with a tin roof. It still has a tin roof on it. I won't take it off. I still don't sleep well when it rains heavily. But that night, the sound of that rain was like a roar. It was like a train. It was so frightening that it forced all of us children out of the bedrooms down into my mother's room without even knowing what we were doing. So one of the things I really want us I want to close here quickly. They told me I had 10 minutes, and I've never done anything in 10 minutes in my life. I want you to understand the importance of the oral tradition, the importance of telling stories. Now, if you know anything about country people, certainly the Clark family, they're storytellers. I inherited that. And so what we want to do is to emphasize the importance of the oral tradition. The stories that you tell are really an important part of the way we capture and preserve and perpetuate the human existence. I know I just spoke into that microphone. I shouted, didn't I? If those of you who are taking a nap while I'm speaking, you're now awake. I think the stories that we hear today will create a narrative for posterity. I think that's very, very important. And then I want to say, why do we observe a tragedy? Why are we here today? Well, of course, we're here to remember those people we lost. It's a way to remember memories. Oftentimes memories are the only thing we have left. And sometimes memories are the only thing that we need, ultimately. The one thing that I remember, that I will always remember, and I see it today, I see it in tragedies that we suffer every day. We saw it in the South River Market destruction. We saw it in El Paso. We saw it in other places. It is the overwhelming power of the human spirit. That is what we are here to celebrate today, the resilience and the power of the human spirit. I think that's probably all I should say, because I'll have you all in tears. Thank you.
I'm not on here, or is it not coming through? Yeah.
We can hear.
I can't hear it. Can you all hear it okay? Yes. Okay. I want to say first, that thank the historical group for asking me to do this. But also I want to thank W.R. Tank Deacon for writing that poem to start with, because without that, this song wouldn't have never existed. And you'll see in one of the lines it says, and the men who were working unable to flee climbed up to the rooftops of the factories. That was his son Jerry at Hermitite. And that was his neighbor James Hall down at the Reeves Brothers. They had to be rescued by boats. And so Tink was a great poem. Okay. It's like Garth Brooks saying, "Got my cowboy hat." He's the first one I ever saw use one of those. But anyway, Tink wrote a lot of it. Maybe that's our fond term for him. He wrote so many poems about things and people and whatever. He published a book, and it's included, of course, The Night of the Flood. Now you have a copy of the words there, and if you want to come in on the chorus, that'll be fine. They're going to get the guitar right? Okay, sing into the mic. Here we go. It was August 19th in the year 69, a night to remember for a long, long time. We'll always remember, and some will still cry, for when the river was high. Oh, that night when the rain began falling so fast, the plants and the factories were all going so blast, for little they knew of the danger at hand, the death and destruction to fall on their land. And in the dirty, muddy water going by, sing along, heeding not any helpless man's cry, it would show us all again that after all we're only men, we can helpless when the water runs high. So helpless when the water runs high. And the men who were working, unable to flee, climbed up to the rooftops of the factory. But those fast asleep in the path of the flood were helplessly trapped by the water and flood. Though a number were lost, many more had been saved by those who took great risks and the torrents they braved. And help poured in from all over the land, America to which to lend helping hand. And then the dirty, muddy water roared by, heeding not any helpless man's cry. It would show us all again that after all we're only men, we can helpless when the water runs high. Oh, so helpless when the water runs high. We will never forget the black night of the flood, when the fields and the towns were under water and mud. We'll always remember, and some will still cry, for those that were lost when the water was high. And then the dirty, muddy water roared by, heeding not any helpless man's cry. It would show us all again that after all we're only men, we can helpless when the water runs high. Oh, so helpless when the water runs high. Yes, so helpless when the water runs high. So helpless when the water runs high.
We'd love it if people could come up to share their remarks. I get that that's going to be a little difficult, but if you have something to say and we want to lead this off, we can be sure we get that nice and well fed with the cameras here. And then I think Tom, I know Tom, because I asked him to. He's a good man, he's doing it. Will be the moderator, can move that around, but also help guide some of the questions that he posed. I did, before that comes, want to make a particular note to first responders. I know Bill Todd is in the audience somewhere. I haven't yet got to speak with him. Hey, Bill. Any other current or past volunteer or professional first responders in the audience? Or people who had family members who were active in there? You certainly know them. Back over there, I missed some. Thank you. You're being humble, but we appreciate it. Thank you very much. I think what Brent said about the changes in scientific forecasting, certainly the changes in how people approach those responses is another important story to be told. So we welcome things, Tom.
I think I'd like to ask people to come down, but I think I can take this thing off and walk around too if I need to, as long as I don't get very close to that speaker. Otherwise, we'll self-destruct. I'd actually like to, I think Bill Todd actually sent a really good story into the News Gazette, so I'd like for Bill to come down if he would. There's a gentleman also who approached me earlier who wanted to talk about Mr. Allen, and I've lost you. I thought I was going to keep you in my radar. Where are you? And I'd like for you to come up and chat as well. But I want you to tell us a few things. I want all of you to feel comfortable coming down here. I don't want you to be shy. I also need to remind you that we need to be out of here by supper time. So you probably should. I know when you're telling stories, you can keep on talking as I do. But I might tug on your elbow or something and whistle at you or something if I think you're going on for 30 minutes. Bill, why don't you, are you here? I'd like for Bill Todd, and Bill is in Glasgow, and as I am. Glasgow is a tough little town. I know Buena Vista thinks it is, but I got news for you. Glasgow's a tough little town too, and Bill's going to tell us how tough.
I survived the flood of '69. I also survived the flood of '69 as a first responder. So if nothing else, that just shows you that I'm really old. When Eric called the other night, it was a phone number that I didn't recognize. There are only a couple places that try to get in touch with me now: funeral homes, insurance for burials, and things of that nature. So I'm glad I went ahead and answered the phone. As Tom said, I'm Bill Todd. Originally from Glasgow, I'm down in Botetourt County. But I was an active member of the Fire and Rescue for many years, rescue for over 15, fire department for over 40. Set the ground a little bit for what occurred on August 19th. I was on vacation. My wife and I were remodeling a kitchen in the house that we just bought a few months before. We wanted to get that out of the way so we could go to the Virginia Association of Volunteer Rescue Squad Convention in Roanoke. It was going to start on Thursday. Since we had the kitchen all torn up, we decided that we were not going to try to fix anything to eat, so we actually went to, a lot of you will remember, Chess's, got a hamburger, I probably got a beer, and we rode to a picnic table up on Snowden Mountain, which we call the Totem Pole. And we were actually eating between 6 and 7, just a little mist of rain, not a steady rain at that time. We had that, we went back to the house, watched a little bit of the 11 o'clock news, just enough to feel sorry for the people on the Gulf Coast that were getting slammed with Camille, the damages they were putting up with. Tired, we went to bed. About 11:30, 11:45, the rain was coming so hard. My father owned a business in town, and I told my wife that I was going to check and make sure the roof wasn't leaking, so I went up to check that. Leaving, maybe this was who Eric was referring to earlier, I left my pregnant wife and oldest daughter there at the house. Well, while I was checking the roof of the business, and this was back in the days, the non-technology days, the alarm for the rescue squad went off, which was just an audible alarm. There was nothing more than train horns. 5 of us responded to the call. We picked up the phone at the building and were told by the dispatcher in Glasgow, there was no central dispatcher or anything of that nature, that a family wanted us to go and check on somebody that was on an island in snow. So we said, okay, no big deal, we'll do that. We knew it was raining hard, but there was nothing to that. We see rain all the time. But boy, before that night was over, we saw rain that we will probably never ever see again in our lives. Made our way to Snowden with our big boat at that time, no Zodiac, 100 horsepower motor, anything, 15-foot boat, probably a 4-foot beam, 12, 15 horsepower engine. So we get into James River, quarter of a mile above the dam. We start up to the island. River's getting angrier every minute that goes by. All of a sudden, the pins in the motor that control the prop started to pop. So you pull the motor up, you put a new pin in, you put it back down, you start it, you proceed. Well, we never got there. We almost ran out of pins. The water was coming up so quick that we barely got back to the boat landing. We actually went below it about halfway between the dam and the boat landing, and we threw a rope to the members on shore, and they pulled us to shore. So we got everything loaded up, went back to Glasgow. We just left 2.5, 3 hours earlier. There was absolutely nothing going on. We got back, the Y, which the Y is no longer there now, it's a T, but the Y was there, completely flooded, no way to get back into Glasgow. So we're gonna go to Buenos and work our way back on 608 Route 11. One of the two, well, there was no way to get to Buenos. So my parents lived on 501, so we actually went down their driveway and went in after scaring the heck out of them coming down at 3 o'clock in the morning. So my mother decided she would fix us all. It was 5 of us that were there. And I might also add that this is why all of you have a story. You need to tell your story. Of the 5 of us that were on the initial call that night, I'm the only one still living. So everyone has a story about the flood. Tell it to someone. Preserve it. Well, anyway, the phones were still working at that time. I was able to get in touch with my wife, who was at a neighbor's house because our house was also flooded. And I understand the water came up so quick that it actually pulled the pajama legs off of my 3-year-old daughter as the neighbor was picking them up to take them out of the flood zone. Well, then we were talking to some of the members at the rescue squad building in the fire department, and we found out that there was a member of the rescue squad and a member of the fire department clinging to a tree. While they were trying to make rescues, they had been flipped out of a boat and they were holding on to a tree. So we get on the phone trying to call Woodrum Field in Roanoke to see if we could get a helicopter, and the phones went dead. So now everything was in the dark. There was no communication whatsoever. There were no cell phones, no pagers, no anything. So you were just basically in the dark in every way. So when daybreak broke, we decided that we would try again to see if we could get back home some way. We couldn't. So we got to the river road, and we thought we would go up the river road and check. There's some houses up there close to the river. So the only way you could really get there with this inadequate boat for this kind of water was to actually go over near the shoreline where the current was the least. So some of us were in the boat, some of us were walking, and we worked our way up to the 2 houses that we really had in question. One was completely covered over. The other one, the water was up to the 2nd story. So we actually took the boat and went a little bit above where the 2-story house was, hoped for the best, pointed the boat towards that, and we actually caught on to the second floor window. There was no one there. The other house was completely covered, there was no one there. So we've done all we could do. We were hopeful that they were up in the mountains somewhere or they'd gone to neighbors or friends. We worked our way back to the Y in Glasgow, and there was nothing really that we could do at that time. We were in radio communications with the crews in Glasgow. We knew they were making rescues. We had no one to rescue where we were, so we were just standing there talking, or as a lot of people that have been associated with fire and EMS, you just shoot the bull. It's as simple as that. You shoot the bull when you're standing around in those quiet times. When talking, the 5 of us that were there, we started looking, and we saw what we really thought was a person in the river. But how could that be? There's no way in the world anybody could be out there in the river. So after discussion, some of us would say yes it was, some would say no. We decided to go ahead and just try something and see if it worked. So we got on the PA system and we said, if you're a person, wave your arm. This arm went up in the air. The river was so angry there was no way that we could do anything to get to them. So we called into Glasgow, talked to another member. Thankfully that night people came there with high-powered boats. And one of the people with the high-powered boat and a couple of the rescue squad members made their way to where we had seen the hand, the arm waving. Couldn't get right to it, but one of the members, the late Bonnie McClure, he actually jumped in the water, went to what turned out to be a 7-year-old girl, brought her back to the boat. They brought her to us because there was no way they could get out of Glasgow. So we thought maybe we could go. Well, we get her in our unit. We come through Buena Vista, and I can't tell you all of the detours that we had to take to finally get through and get to the hospital at Stonewall Jackson. Well, we found out in talking to this 7-year-old girl, Myra, that they'd all gone, 2 families, had gone to the sturdiest barn, the newest barn, the furthest away from the river. The river got so angry that night, it completely changed channel, and that's where the force of the river was. Washed the barn and all of them away. Her dad had put her on a bale of hay. They actually strapped hay together. He had put her on 2 bales of hay strapped together. He stayed with her as long as he possibly could. He knew he could no longer survive, so he pushed her into a tree line. And that's where the bales of hay came to rest. That's where we found her. In physical condition, it was amazing how good she was. I have no idea what life may have been like with her for the last 50 years after having lived an experience like that. So anyway, we finally worked our way back to Glasgow, and you talk about everything that was done with each other and so forth. I was able to get to my house, and the water, as fast as it came up, it also went down quickly. So you're able to start hosing it out, getting the mud out of it, and things of that nature. And over the next days, weeks, months, pretty much my time was devoted to trying to take care of my family, my house. Also, spending time with the fire department, spending time with the rescue squad, and then getting back to work after a couple or 3 weeks away from work. So that was basically what it was. I did mention early on, I think this is worth saying, that the Virginia Association of Volunteer Rescue Squad convention that was being held in Roanoke, it went on. But the majority of the people that attended that convention, Kimball Glass, who was the captain of the Lynchburg Life Saving and First Aid Group, he actually organized search parties. So the convention that year was basically going to Nelson County and searching for bodies. We searched for bodies also in the Glasgow area. We never found everyone. And when you mentioned the trash piles and things of that nature, there's no question. There was everything imaginable in there. So that was my experience as a first responder. I've been through 5 major floods. I've lived through 5 major floods. I have never lived through a flood like Camille, and I hope to goodness that no one ever has to live through a flood like Camille again. It was by far the granddaddy of all floods. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, y'all gonna give me a heart attack up here. Not used to getting in front of people. I'm Bruce Royer. We had Royer's Restaurant in Journalistic. A lot of you probably worked for my father and uncle. But anyway, on the night of the flood, the police always called us if it was a lot of hard rain and everything, because the water would come up on the sidewalk and come inside the restaurant through the bottom doors. So we would go down and we had flood boards that we jammed down in there to keep the water out. So we had a fellow by the name of Hansford Allen. He's the one I really want to talk about. He was living in a shed in 1930 next to the cemetery. And he'd come in the restaurant a couple of times asking for food. Dad had always feed him, so he decided, you know, he'd go find out where he lived. And he was in the shed, no furniture or nothing, sleeping on the dirt floor. So at the restaurant, we had 2 rooms outside of the restaurant building. And Dad brought him back and put him in there. And he lived there from 1930 until the flood in '69. People said he was taking advantage of it. He had a good life after Daddy got hold of it. But anyway, I had gone out there when the police called us at 2 o'clock. We went down. I went out the back door and I went to his rooms where he slept. And I told him, he's sitting there in a rocking chair. And I said, Alan, get in bed. Why are you sitting out there? He said, got new shoes. Don't want to get them wet. I said, okay. So I made the dude just didn't argue with him. So I went on back inside, and later on, the police called, and they came down about 4 o'clock, and they said, well, the water's receding back out to the street. And they thought it was all over with. So Daddy said, go and get Alan and tell him that we're going home, and we'll see him again at 6 o'clock. So I went out there, and he's still sitting in that chair. I said, get in bed. We come back down here at 6 o'clock. He said, no, I've got on new shoes. I don't want to get them wet. It was about 3 or 4 inches of water in the building where he lived. And he had a nice place out there. Oh, and he used it. He lived basically with our family, because he never went anywhere else. He was always there. But anyway, he drowned. And when I went out there and told him we were going home, and I walked back, jumped up on the loading dock and went in the restaurant, and I pushed up the 2 doors in there, steel plate doors. And I told Dad, I said, Alan's okay, but he won't get out of the chair. I said, you want to go ahead and lock up? And he said, yeah, let's get out. I turned around and those doors burst open like that, and the water was this deep on me. So Alan was down there over 7 foot of water outside. And of course, I couldn't get out the door. All I could do was get up to the front. And we had a crawl place underneath the front of the restaurant. And that board had shot all the way up and hit the ceiling. And that's how hard that water was coming in the building. And then of course, the front doors, we opened them up so they wouldn't break off. And that was it. And then we went home afterwards, and the rescue squad got in there the next morning and took Alan on out to the funeral. Which it ended up, it was only a person in Buena Vista that drowned him. But it was no coverage of it. Now I want people to know what he done and what a good person he was. And that's about all I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Royer.
Okay.
Okay, we can still keep going. Anyone up there who wants to come down here, or I'll come to you. Come on down here. And while she's coming, I'm going to tell you a story. And in those photograph albums I mentioned, you'll see lots of photographs of people who are in salvage, you know, but inevitably, remember I talked about the power of the human spirit. Inevitably, there are, you'll see photographs of people shoveling mud and hot and dirty, and they are smiling. Now, maybe they're smiling because they're having their picture made or whatever. You see that spirit, that human spirit at work. People are getting back to work. They're getting into their, you know, they're getting there and cleaning up. Come on up. I can't emphasize enough in what I've seen about how you recover from a tragedy, and it's through the power of the human spirit. I know I sound like an evangelist, but that's okay. It's perfectly fine. Come on. Come on. Your name and where you're from. Tell her where you're from.
I'm Anna Bangley. Can you hear me? My husband is Bernard Bangley, retired Presbyterian minister. Many of you have heard him preach from time to time in various places. Can you hear me now? Okay. My name is Anna Bangley. My husband is Bernard Bangley, and many of you know him. In 1969, we were living in the Presbyterian Manse in Rockbridge, Mass., and he was the minister of Bethesda Presbyterian Church. And on the night of August 20th, when Camille came through this area, I was 2 weeks away from my projected delivery date with my third child, and she was the final one. And this big hole occurred at Cedar Creek that crosses, well, it went under Route 39 between us and Lexington. And there was no way out for us. We couldn't get out to go anywhere. So we had to start thinking about what we were going to do. Now, I know this is kind of piddling when you think of all the tragic things that happened to so many people, but it was kind of a big deal for us. I can't tell you why I didn't get nervous. We waited and waited for the road to be patched, and on the night that Camille came through, we had our windows open because we had no air conditioning in the manse at that time. And we heard this wind that just kept coming and coming and coming, but it never got to us. And we thought that was very strange. And then we realized it wasn't wind, it was water running across the road into the field that was outside our yard, coming down through a barnyard, and it was distributing all kinds of coliform bacteria that eventually got into our well. And of course, we didn't have drinking water for a while. It had to be boiled. Well, in a little bit, the fire siren started wailing, and Bernard tells me it was only one push on the button that John Mast, the neighbor, had pushed the button, but he must have laid on it for a long time because I thought it wailed many, many times. And he got up and dressed and went to see what was going on, and it wasn't a fire. He came back and he said, it's a flood, and I have to go back out. So he says, I sort of went, and turned over and went back to sleep. Well, you know, that pregnant and that sleepy, I guess I can be forgiven. So he went back out and joined the rest of the firemen and other men in the community, and they were up and down the Maury River trying to get people out of their homes to warn them that they were in danger. And he didn't get back until after daybreak, and when he got back, we looked outside our window, and there was a lake in the field outside our bedroom window. And the water had never stood there before. So all this water had come running down across the barnyard and into the field, and that's what contaminated our well. Well, we thought, what are we going to do? And curiously, I never got nervous. I can't tell you why. I just felt like we could take care of things. I grew up on a farm and had a good neighbor, Wilma Mast, who told me if we got into trouble, she had delivered many calves when she was growing up. So we thought, well, a A birth is a birth. Maybe she can handle it. And she and Bernard got together. They had read a book on self-delivery, so we thought, well, maybe it'll work. And I really never got nervous. I don't know why. I grew up on a farm too in Nansemond County, Virginia, and we all learned to be sort of self-sufficient, so I guess that had something to do with it. So this seems kind of mild compared to all of the tragic things that happened that people will tell you about, and I'm glad to give you a good story and not a story that ends in tragedy. We waited, and the road didn't get fixed, and it didn't get fixed. And 2 days before the road was repaired, Bernard went to Suffolk to get his mother to come and stay with the other 2 children. We had a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. I must have been crazy. Jennifer was the last one. There were only 3. So he went to get his mother. And on the second day, after the road had been repaired, I began to experience labor pains after midnight, so I nudged him and I said, Bernard, it's time. So we got up and drove to Stanton, and the doctor called it a photo finish. So, the daughter's name is Jennifer. She's now living in Stanton. She works with the Heifetz International Music Institute as their manager there. So it's interesting that this is where she has wound up, and that's where she was born. So thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bagley. Come on down if you want to talk. Don't be shy. Is there I see someone pointing. Okay, come on up here. So just tell everybody who you are and where you're from.
My name's Gary Conover, I live in Roanoke, and a friend of ours, Karen Duff, about 3 days ago sent me an advertisement about this commemorative session. And I think I came up to represent those who were on the coast of Mississippi on August 17th. I was stationed at Keesler Air Force Base, August 17th. We lived in a mobile home. They were saying anyone under 20 feet sea level, get out, because it ended up with a 25-foot surge tide in Biloxi, Mississippi, and Gulfport. Biloxi is 10 miles east of Gulfport. The eye came on shore at Gulfport. But we were out of reach of the surge tide, but decided we could not stay in a mobile home in a Category 5 hurricane. The winds did reach upwards of 190 miles an hour, gusting over 200 miles an hour. We got all kinds of stories to tell, but I just felt like I should come up here to represent those who were at the eye of the hurricane when it came ashore. Thank you.
It's good. Hi, I'm Elise Sheffield. I grew up on South River. I still live on South River, just above the confluence with the Maury River. And I'm actually here to bear witness to the flood for probably your youngest witness, which would have been my 3-year-old sister. I was 8 at the time. My sister grew up to be a poet. And though she has passed away, she wrote a poem about that night on the river. As reference, our home was on a small rise above the South River, and we were quite isolated from other homes. When we woke up in the morning, we discovered we were an island. So this was the 3-year-old perspective filtered through an adult channeling that 3-year-old. It's called Snow in August. Downstairs in my pajamas that pouring night, woken by a noise, I found her wading strange basement waters swirling in from the garage, things afloat around her in the wavy flashlight arc, her arms full of my father's books and papers. "Back to bed," she ordered when she saw me, big-eyed, pillow-haired, her 3-year-old. That was my mother, down in the basement in the dark in the middle of the night. The others were asleep. My father, this I knew, away that night in the hospital. I heard Disaster's "right now" voice in hers, the way I hear it in my own, when all there is to do is to save what you can hold and let the nightmare rise until it spills its banks. Not arguing, I climbed back up the stairs, tucked myself in bed, and slept. Meanwhile, ponies bolted for high ground, the Plymouth wagon filled with sand, poles and roads washed out. Upstream, a neighbor's house slid under midnight's freight train roar, cattle caught in toppled trees. A girl up the valley couldn't hold on anymore. Waking, not remembering, to dreamy day glare, I was sure the window's dazzle could only mean one thing. The world transformed by icy clarity. Never mind, this was Virginia in August. I didn't see the river's chaos in the fields, buzzards wheeling. How could earthly trouble give off such light? I even danced a little in the bleary shine of it, thinking of holidays and gifts, before I recognized the mud, the draining aftermath, and ran, blinking with my news, my arms out to my mother, weary in her muddy robe, who already had saved as much as she knew how, and let the rest drift off, irretrievable. And that's my sister Haynes Sprunt and her 3rd-year vision of the flood, probably her first poetic impact of her whole life. Thank you.
Hi, can y'all hear me? All right, my name is Sue Ewald. I grew up here in Pembroke, or here in Buena Vista. I was the oldest of 5, thank you. And I'm also a 1971 graduate. Yes. Anyway, that summer I was 16 also. My father, who some of you may remember, was Harry Ewald. He managed the Virginia National Bank out at the corner of 21st and Sycamore. He was also a fireman, volunteer fireman. Well, that night, we went to bed, the 19th, and nobody slept well because, again, the rain. Our house was built in 1892, so the water going over the dam actually shook the windows at times. And we had a metal roof on the house, and you could hear it just... So it sounded like World War III, really. So during the night, we were up, you couldn't sleep, and they called my dad, the fire department sent out the call, the big whistle, the fire whistle went off, and then the police called Daddy, and he says, "Harry, you might want to get down to the bank, water's rising up, go to check on it." Well, we had a gentleman, his name was John Lyle Sr., and John worked at the Chevrolet Warndecker Chevrolet Motors, and then he was custodian of the bank at night. And Dad also had the vice president, I guess, Bill Gilbert. Well, Bill came down, Dad came down, Mr. Lyle was already there. And the water was coming up so fast, they couldn't keep up with it. and they had a back room where they kept all the records. And they were trying to get the records up to an upper level to keep them dry. But they were working so hard, and the water was rising so fast that the pressure wouldn't let them open any of the doors, particularly the back door to this room. Well, Daddy could swim, and Bill could swim. Notice that Mr. Lau couldn't. And they had done all they could do, and the water was up. It was chin deep. It was all they could do. They were standing on the desk. And Dad said, well, John, you're going to learn to swim tonight. They weren't about to leave you behind. And he was a big guy. He was a big guy. And between the Lord above and Daddy and Bill and John, they all made it to the second story. Well, at home, in the meantime, we were bailing water. This big old house, the hot water heater was in the basement. It was up on a little concrete ledge. Well, my mother was in the basement with a bucket. And we were two. She'd fill one up, she'd give me one halfway up the cellar steps, and I'd give it to my sister, and she would dump it out the back door, and it was probably coming right back in the house. But we were up high. The house was up high at the corner of 24th and Oak. But we had water funneling down off the mountains through the hills, and we had 5 wet water springs behind the house, and it was like a river rushing, just rushing. And it was just a nightmare. And it was dark. It was dark. You couldn't see anything. All you could do was hear. There was no moon. There were no stars. There was nothing. And the next day, as I said, the water was receding. We didn't hear anything from my dad. He made it home sometime that afternoon. We were trying to clean up. Well, anyway, they got that done. I was part of the Red Cross. I volunteered with them when they came to town. And so many people, adults, teenagers, young people came and were helping everywhere. And we all came together, and it was just the amount of love and concern. Nobody put themselves first. They were all concerned about one another. And it was the biggest outpouring of love and big hearts all over this. Vesuvius, Cornwall, Lexington, Natural Bridge, Glasgow, Buena Vista. We had Roanoke. We had people coming in when they could get in, bringing supplies, fresh water. It was amazing. It was truly amazing. And I will never take anything for granted. To look at someone, there's good there in everyone, and it takes the worst of times to bring that out. And it did. Our humanity, it shone like a bright star. And I'll never forget it. I never will. So I'm glad we survived.
Yeah, I can't say enough about human spirit. We have one more. I think we have a couple more here. A couple more, and then I'm going to send you home to supper.
Go just a little bit further than she was talking about the folks coming to help. Must include the Amish folks from up in Burton, Pennsylvania, that came down and helped rebuild barns and other things as well. But getting on to my personal story, that afternoon of August 19th, I was working for that summer, I was working for the Virginia Tech Extension Service, and we were at Dr. Sebastian's, which many of you folks have heard the name, I'm certain, and we were out there weighing and grading his cattle. And things kind of closing in, as has been mentioned earlier. I was reading the scales, we were trying to get finished, rains were starting, lightning was flashing. I was reading the scale beam by the flashes of lightning. That night we finished. I got home. I live out at Timber Ridge. Water was running across the backyard driveway of my home about 6 inches deep. I went in and Daddy was getting ready to go to work. Mother, he worked at Reeves on graveyard. Mother said, Joe, don't go, you don't, yep, they need me tonight. He went to work, said he got to work about 12 o'clock, I think he said. They came through, said, if y'all want out, you better get out. They were putting stuff up higher and higher and higher in the plant. Said about 1 o'clock, explosion upriver, uptown. Things started bumping into and lights went out. Things started bumping inside the plant. There they were in the dark, not knowing what was going on or anything. Daylight comes, they look out over the chain link fence, see a radio antenna on a vehicle here, another one there, that's all they could see. Meanwhile, we were at home. They're again mentioning a name that probably some of you remember, Skip Huff on the old WREL. And how Skip Huff would just rattle on and rattle on and rattle on about break his thumbnail maybe. So Mother was tuned into the radio, which we didn't have we had electric service in Timber Ridge. You know, something bad going on. Says it's been flooded. Wonder what happened to your dad. He's down at the university where it's all hell broke loose. So we had company from, it was very, the wife was very charged up, a very excitable lady. And she said, John Henry, we got to get out of here. We got to get out of here. And the road bank had slid off around the road. I'd gone out and checked the road. So we got out, finally got him out. Finally, about 10 o'clock that morning, Daddy comes walking home. They came in boats, took him out over the chain link fence around Reeves Brothers up to dry ground. He walked over the railroad up here, railroad bridge, and somebody picked him up, brought him up on 81, let him off. But you know, and then I got on out and went to work that morning. Picked up at lunchtime, picked up my girlfriend, who later became my wife. We went down to check on my cousin on South River, and there at Marl Creek, that box culvert had washed out, and there all that field was down through their field the first time, and then in '85, it washed out again, right there on the, I guess on the Neriah side, I'll say the Neriah side of South River there, up that box culvert. It's been out and back in twice. I would hope they put in a bigger one the second time when it washed out. But you know, thank goodness things were minimal here compared to across the mountain in Nelson, which we've seen on Channel 7 this morning. The documentary that Channel 7 had on TV there this morning, but it was terrible, but thank goodness those of us survived, and things in the community have come back strong.
Okay, I'm Sherry Southers Wheeler, and I texted my daughter, one of my daughters who's here tonight, and I told her I thought I'd get up, and she said, you need to for posterity's sake. I said, okay. I was 13 during the '69 flood, and I remember we lived on Cypress Avenue, and I remember Dad putting up the garage door, and we could not see the neighbor's house. That's how hard it rained at that time. Mom and Dad owned Kenny's here in Buena Vista. They built Kenny's in 1963, and I remember Dad talking about two things that he learned from that flood. The floodwaters in Kenny's was 9 feet. There were 9 feet of water. That time they had the A-frame building, the old building, and it was up to the eaves of that building. And Dad, I'll never forget, it's the only time I ever remember my dad crying. And my grandparents had tried to get to him and to Kenny's to help with things, and it was too late. They lost their car down on 22nd Street, 21st Street, somewhere along there. But Dad learned two things from that flood. he learned, I remember being in the building when the water started to come up, and they had drains in the floor and the water was coming up through the drains. And I remember the two things that he learned. Number one, you dump the grease. I mean, who would have thought it, you know? You dump the grease outside. Number two, you cut off the power before it goes out on its own. The grease, of course, with the water went up. When the water came down, everything was covered in grease. And that was horrible. That was a mess. It was not just mud from the flood, but it was grease from the cookers and everything in the building. So it took a long, long time to get all that mess cleaned up. And they lost a lot of equipment because the motors continued to run up until the time there was no power. So he learned two things from that flood, and he had to use that experience in the next flood in '85. So he said he learned from that flood in 1969. And he was also in the 1936 flood. He was 7 years old, and he remembers me and Carrie, they lived close to Burnson Mills in a little house there, and he said one of the neighbors carried him out on their shoulders during that flood. So he had been in a previous flood, but of course he didn't know about the grease or the power. That wasn't on his radar back then. But I was talking about my dad crying during that flood, and during that night, I mean, all night long, just, you know, he was losing everything, he thought. Until the next morning, and the sun came up, he put on his boots, he put on his gloves, he and Mom both, and they went to work. And they realized that, you know, we lost a business, but they didn't lose their home. So he knew that he was blessed. And I learned from that from my dad. He was a great man. He was at times a little stinker. He was a businessman, and I loved him, and I miss him every day. Thank you.
We're going to do, I know I said we were going to end, but we're going to do one more here. And then Sarah Clayton has done an interview with Myra, a young 7-year-old who was on the hay bale, and we'll end with her. Sarah will tell you the end of that story, or at least the rest of that story.
Thank you. My name is Paula Charlton. I'm a retired teacher here in Buena Vista, graduate of Perry McClure class of '69. That's right. I had memories of that night. 3 things I remember of that whole time was the horrific rain, the silence, the dead silence the next morning, hearing nothing but rushing water and helicopters. And even though I was 18, for months after that, when I heard a helicopter, I had to stop and I shivered because I remembered what those helicopters were doing. But I thought I'd give just a quick, different perspective. I taught here for 38.5 years. For 13 years, I taught math, science, and social studies in 3rd grade. One of the science things we had to teach was about floods. I brought the book that's over here about Camille, the original book. I brought it to my 3rd graders one year when we were doing that, and for 5 days, literally an entire week, when they came in, they said, "Can we talk about Camille again?" Well, you know, I didn't really care about the standards of learning that Richmond had sent us, and I didn't care what my principal thought. These children lived here. This was part of their heritage and their history, and they needed to know it. When we finished that I said, "Do you have any questions?" One little boy said, "Were you living back then?" I said, "Yes, son. I had just graduated from Perry McClure High School." And another student, I don't remember whether it was a boy or a girl, said, "That was horrible. Why are we still here?" And I said, "You know why we're still here? Because that's what Buena Vista is. Not just Buena Vista, but the people in Nelson County, because we'd gotten a map out, we'd found Nelson County, we talked about." I said, "That's why we're here. We're strong, we help one another, and we're grateful every day for what we have. I hope that didn't verge on being religious in a school setting, but I thought it was appropriate. We are still here. We're not going anywhere. These other localities aren't going anywhere. And we're going to be here for a long time to come.
Good afternoon. I thought I would add the ending to this. In 1969, I graduated from high school. I grew up here, and I happened to be at Cape Hatteras working, so I had no memory of the floods. But a month ago, my colleague and I did an interview with Myra. Is Myra here by any chance? Myra's had a lot of tragedy in the last year, but I just felt that her story was so important to tell. She told me of the night of the 19th. She was sitting with her family watching a Western program. Audie somebody singing, and her father went out to check the water. They lived on, I'm talking about the families that the gentleman, the very first gentleman, told about going to the houses on River Road down from Glasgow. And she was the girl in the house that was covered up. By that time, they had moved up to the second house, the neighbor's house, and the waters came up. And so they went up further to a barn that was further up the hill. The waters rose. She says she remembers waking up and the barn was twirling. She was 7. She was sitting with her parents before all this. This is just a few hours before all this. It came up this fast. Her father tried to get the truck started, but the water was too high and it flooded out. And she remembers waking up at 7 years old with the barn turning, and creaking, and boards. And the next thing she knew, her father had her by the scruff of the neck. They were being pushed down the water, and her father grabbed her. Somehow they connected in the waters. And he put her on a hay bale, those old square bales that we all know so well, and said, "Hold on, don't let go." And that was the last she saw of him. And she continued on down the river, and she just says she just knew she just had to hang on. 7 years old at night. And she said the next thing she remembers is the hay bale came apart on her. Now this is where our stories diverge, so I'm not sure which is. The hay bale came apart on her, and she remembers being under the water with logs and wood and just twirling. And the next thing she remembered is she was on a piece of plywood, and she described it to me as if the wood was just doing this. She remembered the motion of the wood. And what it seems to me, the way she describes it, is she had been pushed into an eddy of logs. You know how the logs pile up on each other. And she was in this eddy, in this pool. And she remembered hearing this voice call out, as the gentleman recalled, "Is anyone out there?" And she remembers raising her hand, 7-year-old little hand in these floodwaters. And they tried to come and get her, and her story is the boat couldn't get to her. They would go up the river and come down, but they just couldn't get into where she was located. And finally, this very brave man, who I understand is no longer with us, jumped in the water and got over to this young girl, and they threw a line, and she was taken to, in a very roundabout way because of water over roads, to the hospital. And one of the things she had brought to this interview and held up was a tiny little red dress that the hospital ladies had gone down to Main Street, Lexington, and bought her a little dress the next day because she was just in rags at this point. And she still has this little dress from the flood, and it still affects her that's probably why she isn't here. She's also Jenna Ray's grandmother. So she's been hit with great tragedy in her life. And they went to this family that had 4 people in the next house. Her family was 4 people. She was the only one who survived out of those 8 people. So she's had a lot to live with. Right now, she lives above Carrs Creek, on a very high hill above Carrs Creek, and she's a very lovely, sane person. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to close this now. I think Eric may want to say a thing or two, but please join us for refreshments, and thank you for coming to hear these stories and to tell your stories.
I just want to add, it's nice to finish with Sarah because we have yet to, where are you? We have yet to fix a date, but Sarah and Jennifer Young will be doing one of our programs on the Carrs Creek area. Many of you may have seen them do a House Mountain program about these numbers too, so we look forward to that. Thank you all. We hope you'll visit. I'll loop the slideshows again if you didn't get to see that. Be well. Come support the Rockbridge Historical Society again.